Right. Okay. Off a day. All right, Nenga. Beitzek todo esticia. All right. Let me just make sure that everything is working. And okay, looks like we are on Instagram as well. Biba biba. All right. Half a day. All right, half a day. Everything is working. We are live now.
Half the day, everyone.
Half a day, half a day. All right. Buenas and half a day, todos hamzu. This is another episode of Fanachu Hungan. And so, have with me here today somebody who has been on Fanachu a few times over the years, but Hungan friends of Fanachu, friends of independent Guahan, and what's it called? A very strong ally and supporter of independence for Guahan Hungan. Attended many of our events back in the day, but is now what's it called? In the trenches of job hunts, academic job hunts right now in the States. And so I'm very excited to have with me once again Dr. Josephine Faith Ong, who has been on. We were counting, and I think this is Josephine, this is your fourth time back on Fanachu because just to give you a sense, Fanachu started 9 years ago. That was when Manny Cruz, now Dr. Manny Cruz, that's when Manny Cruz was filming episodes that were primarily audio in the Humanities and Social Humanities Conference Room or HSS 106 at the University of Guam. And then Josephine was there with the media crew for Independent Guahan. And then Josephine was also super helpful, a strong organizer for Filipinos for Guahan. Uh, you were part of solidarity conversations, connecting Chamorro voices and Filipino voices around decolonization. And then, yeah, so many times you have been a voice
Yeah.
you have been an important voice in this conversation. And so I'm very excited, though, that you are back and you are a recently christened doctor, PhD as well. And so,
Yeah.
Josephine, Purifinatomo, thank you for coming back on Fanatsu.
Uh, Sana Maase Miguel. Miguel has seen me since I was a baby academic and helped mentor me. So I'm really grateful for this invite, but also grateful for the very flattering introduction. And I was just remembering all those times where I think like Manny and all of us would just hang out, and now that we're all doing great things at UOG. So um yeah, today I'm going to be presenting a part of my book project, which is basically looking at different infrastructure projects that were aiming at transforming Guam from the 1800s to the present. And I'm looking at both Spanish and US colonial uh, legal infrastructure, but also physical infrastructure projects that are basically trying to shape Guam's environment and thus shape how Chamorros and the Filipino workers who were often recruited to conduct these projects were um, how they would relate to one another, but also how their labor and also for Chamorros, how the disruption of their indigenous ties to place would would further colonial control. I did have an ask though before I begin from Filipinos for Guahan folks. Miguel, this is pertinent to you because it's about the COD call on the exhibit donations. Um, Miguel, do you have like a basic blurb that should I just share the one that's on the website? I have it
Oh,
pulled up. Yeah.
go ahead. If you want to, go ahead. And then, I mean, I can talk about it, or do you want to talk about it? Or,
I guess like you could talk about the briefer and then Filipinos for Guahan. I'll just say now, like Filipinos for Guahan is planning a Mabuhay Merienda, which is our usual events where we bring in like and have community conversations. Sometimes we have workshops. And sometimes we talk about trauma led by clinical not clinical psychologists, psychologists, social workers who help us guide and approach these kinds of important topics in intentional ways. We've also collaborated with Guam Sustainable Culture, especially because one of our co-founders, Faustino Briano, is also a board member of Guam Sustainable Culture. And what we're trying to do now is Dr. Tabitha Espina is one of our co-founders as well, and we're hoping to specifically curate a conversation and a donation kind of workshop, but also kind of like share back of Filipino solidarity work, but also general stories about Chamorro Filipino relations that could be used for the exhibit, and hopefully contribute to diversifying, but also like making this broad conversation about decolonization, also complicating the narrative that it's a Chamorro only and conversation, and that it will only benefit Chamorros through our own stories, our own memories, and just like and maybe some random posters that are hanging around or pictures that are hanging around your house. Which is the case for me, but I would have to mail it back. Yeah, Miguel, did I miss anything about it?
No, thank you for reminding me about that, and I'm glad that Tabitha is helping with that. I was
Mhm.
trying to look for the flyer. I know it's on Instagram. I know, hold on, I should have a copy of, here it is. Here it is, right here. Let me just put it up on the screen real fast. So, and just as a reminder for people, and so as Josephine here was mentioning, um, if you have anything in your family that you feel can help in an upcoming Guam Museum exhibit related to sort of telling the story of decolonization over the past 100 years, please reach out. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to the Commission on Decolonization. Dr. Tabitha Espina is helping. She's working on the exhibit curation and the exhibit uh, sort of narrative and research for this. And so, and then Jamela reached out, Jamela Santos reached out, and I'm so excited that, she's working to donate some stuff from Filipinos for Guahan. And so we're looking for things which some people might associate with a decolonization movement,
Mhm.
posters, like you were saying, banners, protest signs, but also T-shirts. T-shirts are a very, very like Guam thing, right? And so
Yeah.
like Fanogi March, one of the things that whenever people who volunteered for the Fanogi March got T-shirts. And so
Yeah.
here you got a T-shirt and people showed up in their Chamorro Pride, in their local Pride T-shirts, but also letters, uh, newspaper clippings, articles, anything that can help us and not just and when we say sort of decolonization, we don't just mean like those who protested, but those who may have pushed for change in other ways as well. And so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, reach out to the museum, reach out to the Commission on Decolonization. But thank you for
Mhm.
Filipinos for Guahan for being very conscientious and like putting this out there into the community, and taking, helping to remind others about this conversation.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that in before we end because I tend to get distracted. But it's related to my topic actually because um my work and my first book project, which I'm working on and I've been working on for the past throughout my PhD, and many of you who know me personally know how this project has both plagued me and excited me. But basically, I'm presenting a part of chapter 1 of my book that discusses different infrastructure projects. And I come at this from the perspective of someone whose family works in the construction industry in Guam. My dad owns Guam Hardwood. So I grew up around construction. I actually used to work in Guam Hardwood too. So I was a kid sorting out nails. And it really shape my understanding of Guam and also my access to the kinds of things that work within the construction industry is unique because of my positionality as a class privileged Chinese Filipino. And so, but also someone that grew up in Guam and later learned more about Chamorro stories of place. And honestly, did the hard work of climbing up and down the hikes, visit sacred sites. I was like, it's so much easier in the continent to visit sacred sites in Guam. Sometimes you really have to, I think do the work, and I think that's important. And so I'm gonna talk a bit today about the earlier history of when Filipinos came to Guam and mainly were recruited to build Spanish infrastructure projects, which were mainly around rebuilding the farming industry, rebuilding the roads, and rebuilding Upper Harbor, so that the Spanish could recover from losing one of their main colonies, Nueva España, in 1828. So, I'm gonna do a quick introduction into this history, and I'm gonna talk about the archives or the sources I looked through, mainly because it's difficult to access them for multiple reasons, and I'll talk a bit about how that works, and especially thank Dr. Carlos Madrid, Dr. Underwood, and so many great folks who helped advise me with this research. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a community effort also. And yes, I had to relearn Spanish from high school Spanish. And many of us in Guam, like we learn either Japanese or Korean because of the tourism industry has. I learned Spanish because I thought it'd be closer to Tagalog. And it's true, but that's because of the colonial influence. And so returning to Spanish was a bit of a bittersweet thing for me for this project. But I really want to do it because of how um, a lot of the times when I was doing the Solder podcast, Miguel, like we would receive questions about like, oh, the Spanish time was different. Chamorros and Filipinos got along and they intermarried. And so this narrative started to like really bother me because I actually came to Guahan in 2001. I was definitely a settler in a way, but I was also a child that just like migrated to a new place. I had to learn American English for one, which is interesting in a US colony. Um, and so having that experience was something, and that kind of made me realize how different my positionality was as a first or 1.5 gen Filipino that started doing solidarity work. Many of us in Filipinos for Guahan, most folks are second or third gen. I'm probably one of the few that are one and a half, one first gen. And so that led me to kind of look back at the history and wonder why is that narrative in place and for Chamorros and Filipinos today, both Chamorros and Filipinos, actually. And so I want to begin with this story. Written in Spanish. So um, this is a letter from the Principalia, who were the Chamorro political leaders, Militzo, and they wrote this in December 16, 1886, and they sent this to the Spanish governor of Guam. I've translated this here, and basically, I'm going to read it. It sounds nicer in Spanish, but I'm going to read it in English for accessibility purposes. So basically, quote, Mariano Areola is of her conduct because in addition to not dedicating himself to any work, he also spent much time going to Hagåtña to live with his mistress Ana Flores, a Chamorro woman who was married to Juan de los Reyes. There had been two occasions where he had no shame in bringing her to town of Maletsu as if she were his own, creating a scandal for everyone. In addition, he and Pedro Ada, his neighbor in Hagåtña, went angry in this town and introduced. I think the correct translation for this would be like went like they went wild in this town, introduced the bad custom of gambling. And so I want to bring this as an example of Filipino convicts who did not do labor for the Spanish colonial government. And so when I first read this document, I was wondering a lot of different things. First, how did this why did someone's public affair become such a political concern? Something that is supposed to be private, and maybe they were going about it publicly, but why did it become the point where the political leader sent a complaint to the Spanish government, which then led to actually Ariela's deportation back to Guam? And second, why is Ana Flores's perspectives um, as a Chamorro woman not being discussed in this letter at all? This is a screenshot of the letter I found, and it is basically how a lot of Spanish colonial archives are written from this time. But what is different about it is that it's written from Chamorro political leaders themselves. And so this is not just it's written in the style of the Spanish government because these folks would have had to have Spanish education, be able to read and write, but they would also have to be elected from the cabezas de barangay, which means the heads of the households. So the way that the Spanish colonial government actually worked was actually more representative of Chamorro's social systems, which is interesting, but it was still imbued with Spanish requirements like, oh, you had to have money, you couldn't have debt, you had to have a certain plot of land. Yeah, actually, I don't think it was the plot of land. It was that you had no debts, but that you were elected from your family and you had to be able to read and write. And so it produces this kind of like narrative of, hey, why are these like folks who are relatively privileged in society reporting about these Filipino convicts, but also what are these Filipino convicts doing that are resulting in the investigations of Chamorro political leaders? After all, they are convicts, and I think nowadays it's easier for us to remember them as the ancestors of many Chamorro families, since a lot of intermarriage happened after convicts that decide to stay stayed. But I think it's also important to contextualize in this history that Chamorros and Filipinos, when we looked in the archive and we mix it with oral histories from today's mixed families, it's both that they got along, but also that there's a lot more tension that maybe we're not remembering today. And so this led me to kind of ask, why are we not remembering this? And also, why is this archive and this depiction of Filipino criminality and Filipino resistance, but also resistance that can be problematic too? Why are they leading to deportation as an answer? Why is removal an answer? And where are Chamorro concepts of justice and mutuality, like mutual relations, like Gentula and Inafamalik, why are they like, kind of the subtext and not the primary way these conflicts are being resolved? Second, why are these reports written from the perspectives and kind of talking over perspectives of Chamorro men? And why are they talking over Chamorro women? What is this saying about Chamorro women's mobilities and our contemporary understandings of it? This is a picture of Chamorro women, called maidens crossing the Agana River Bridge in Guam that I found in my archives as well. I donated some of my archives to Mark. I donated my interviews, but some of these archives are also available in the Mark if folks would like to look into it as well. And I'm trying to see how I can create a community archive from some of these Spanish documents as well, because one thing I wanted to get into is that they're very hard to read. They're written in old school 1800 Spanish. You have to be able to understand Spanish of a certain level, so you have to have intermediate reading level of Spanish, but you also have to be able to decipher the handwriting.
The
And so,
cursive, the
yeah,
cursive,
the cursive.
the
Look at
cursive
this.
is
It's
so
like,
crazy. Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
and also the documents are not always well preserved. So, but actually, Mark has a lot of these archives actually. So, the copies of it are at Mark. The originals are in the Philippines. A lot of it is actually in the National Archives of the Philippines. And because my family is now based mainly in Manila, what I would do is trudge myself to the National Archives of the Philippines. So it's just halfway across town for me. But interestingly enough, because after the independence of Nueva España, the Philippines took control, administrative control of Guam. So that's why a lot of the government archives from this time are actually under the Philippines. And then there was an agreement, and Mark was able to digitize a lot of it. But if you want the originals, they're in the Philippines, and they're slightly better quality, but there's another problem there too, is that it's hard to look through their stuff. It's very it's organized, but also difficult to find certain documents. So it really takes an understanding of like what to look for, and also when to kind of know when to stop. That maybe it's like not as fruitful. But thankfully I was affiliated with Dartmouth. I had a research fellowship with Dartmouth for 2 years, and that gave me the ability to have my translations checked. I was able to use some of my grant money to um have an expert in deciphering Old Spanish, read through it, and read through my archives, and then I would translate it from there. So that's how I was able to get a lot of these archives actually written out and like transcribed for me to be able to analyze them. And then the way I analyzed them was from the perspective of feminist archival analysis, which is basically a way of saying, how do we know when colonial archives, written documents, when do they center women's stories, but also when do they not? When do they erase women's voices? And also, how does centering different forms of knowledge then lead to our nuancing of under a more nuanced understanding of history and what happened in Guahan? And I really focus on Indigenous feminist geography, especially my advisor was the Tonawanda Band of Seneca feminist and geographer Mishana Goman, and she talks about how Indigenous stories are ways of understanding one another, but also understanding what she calls Indigenous story ties to place. And so I kind of relate that to my work and basically an understanding of how Indigenous stories, both orally and also in the archive and reading against the archive, how is that going to tell us a more nuanced understanding of the Spanish Empire? How is able to control and limit Chamorro-Filipino relations, but also moments when Chamorros and Filipinos were able to resist, and how the resistance is being coded as something to control, something to criminalize. And so I was kind of reading the archive against the grain. So when I would see things like this person is pessimista conducta, which is what was referred to by Areola, what was being used to talk about Areola, I would look at that and think about why are they being called deviant? Why are they being seen in this way? And then I would use that to kind of think, is it resistance? Is it not? But also I would ask myself, when is Filipino men specifically is resistance? When is that also harming Chamorro women? And so that is another part of chapter 2 and actually the end of chapter 1 that I am working on, which is the stories of sexual violence I found in the archive. But for now, I first want to go through the historical context of how the Spanish actually brought Filipino convicts to the Marianas, especially because some of this history isn't always discussed. And so the Spanish colonial and like prison or carceral practices in the Marianas really began in the 1600s, in the late 1600s, when Filipino missionaries and conscripted soldiers were used to implement the process of reducción, which is basically translated to reduction. And I think there have been a lot of debates about whether or not to call uh, the what has been known as the Chamorro-Spanish Wars as a genocide or a war. And I think really, like if we had to divide by UN terms, yes, it would be a genocide. But I think it's important to foreground that there was a lot of violence in moving Chamorros from their ancestral homelands, especially because folks are so based on their clan and they're taking care of a specific type of place and making sure that there's control around um, I think that is a form of violence in itself, in addition to the physical violence and Filipinos' participation in this. And a lot of them were also conscripted, so it puts another layer that I think someone else could do this project. There is quite a bit of documents on it in the mark. I think it's an interesting analysis of like it. We can analyze and think about how it's impacted us today, but for the purposes of my work, I wanted to think about this earlier history as a way to then influence how Filipinos are seen as reliable workers. So this was a picture of the main street in Hagatnya in the early 1900s. This was created through the process of reducción in Hagatnya itself. So this earlier history of the Marianas, where the Marianas was kind of the division, I think, between the Nor, what we now know as the Sinama and Guahan, I think began with the reducción. Also, because what the sim did was it moved Chamorros from the North Marianas to the capital of Hagatnya. And what it was meant to do was Reducción was this policy of building La Plaza Mayor, or the important major plaza, in the capital, and that would have the iglesia or church and the colonial administrative buildings. And then all the Chamorro houses and this was like how the Spanish colonial government worked in general. So this is also how California was set up. Um, or would then be surrounded so that the colonial center was supposed to control and emanate outward. It was like a process of surveillance and control, but it was also a process of creating order in a new colonized place. And so that's why a lot of the Spanish colonial government projects in Guam focused on Reducción and ensuring that the La Plaza Mayor and the main church, what we now know as the cathedral, is as beautiful as it is today. And so I argue in my book that Reddition was not supposed to just be about rebuilding like the physical structure, but it's actually a way to physically change and reorient Chamorro society and cultural practices. So for instance, like one example I talk about in my work is uh they the translation was that the society had to live by the bell, and that was the bell of the church. So I think many of us who study Guam history know that Chamorros went to the lunchos and the weekend, and the weekday they had to come back, and so the bell was like, it's time for Sunday, time to go back to Hakatnya. And so it was really a process of trying to change Chamorro society, change the timing, change what people did, when and where people went. In Governor Felipe de la Corte's memoir, so Governor Felipe de la Corte was the one who really began using Filipino convict workers, and he mainly wanted to use Filipino convict workers to rebuild Guam's port and rebuild the export capacity of Guam, because with the independence of Nueva España, Spain lost a lot of its profitable colonies. All it really had left was Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam. And so we can talk later about the Treaty of Paris and what happened after that. But basically, it was trying to make something of a dying empire. And so it was trying to make Guam more profitable. And Felipe de la Corte was both a military, he was a military engineer. So actually, the whole government in Guam at the time was also a military government. I think it's important to contextualize that Guam has long been under military governance, and that even on these infrastructure projects, there were soldiers stationed to make sure that Filipino convicts did their work. And so when it came to the process of reducción, it was all and the infrastructure projects. One, it was about making there being like an expert capacity, but it was also about rebuilding a lot of the infrastructures and the physical buildings that had fallen into disrepair. And so what Corte wanted to do was use Filipino labor to rebuild that, but also ensure the process of Redstone continued. And so he says that in his memoir, he talks about and he analyzes Guam history from the Spanish colonial perspective. And he said quote, reducción debió resultar de aquí un cambio total de hábitos, or it really created there must have been a complete change of habits here in the Marianas because Chamorros became scrupulous, like very on point descendants after Reducion. And so he's painting Reducion as a substantial change in Chamorros, and it's making them like respectable citizens, basically. And so I wanted to highlight here, converting the remaining. He's talking about the large process of violence that was created, and the genocide of Chamorros, and the continued survival. He's painting it as Chamorros are then becoming more productive rather than the actual form of survival and resistance that Chamorros often did, which he later complained about, and I'll get to it there. I'll get to it here actually. And so actually in his memoir, I looked at the archive, the depictions he had of Chamorro labor on infrastructure projects. So at first he tried to use Chamorros because Chamorro men were supposed to work on las obras públicas or the public works projects. But instead of showing up, they didn't go at all. They just didn't go. Or it's like if you're from Guam, like people will still do this. But like they just thought it wasn't important. And the reason why was because they were still dedicated and going back to their lanchos. And this is what Cortesing is that they are not prioritizing el pueblo estacionario or a stationary Chamorro society. So he's seeing them as these immoral, lazy ass Chamorros who are going to their lanchos to grow things like the things that are staples in Chamorro diets and not the usuals that he would have preferred, which is coffee and rice, export products. And so, the only export product that was there was Justo Dunca's copra plantation. He was a former Filipino convict, who married into another convict, a former Filipino convict's family, and was able to have a large copra plantation where he employed former convicts. He was also like one of the few non-Chamorro political leaders in Hagatna, the capital center. So that means he was really well to do. Um, and it was because he was able to export a lot from the copra. And actually, people would go there to, he made tuba. And in the Spanish colonial documents, I wrote about this in chapter two. It's like they frame Sagatnya as a place where the colonial government and control is the strongest. But right next door, because Husadunka was a merchant, there was a tuba place, and all the Filipinos and Chamorros would go there to drink tuba. So house. The Donka house also is like where that was. There was like on the back a place to make tuba, and they would just hang out and drink. So there are these ways I think of disrupting colonial narratives of like everything was proper, everything was meticulous, or like, they were drinking tuba, my God. Like so it's like I think a bit more complicated than what Court is laying on is what I'm trying to say. And that Chamorros continued to resist by going to their lanchos. And it wasn't so simple as what the Spanish colonial government depicted. They also interestingly assumed that Chamorro women, because they're women, would just stay at home in Hagatya. This is something that's both contradicted in the actual in like oral history interviews I did with Chamorro women, but also in some of the archives written by Chamorro women that lived partially in the Spanish period, like Agatha Johnson. Like she talks about Sadok Hagatya as a meeting place. And there is a picture here from the early 1900s of Chamorro women washing their clothes in the Hagatya River. And so the Hagatya River was like basically one of the borders between like the end of the capital and the roads, some of which would led to they mainly led to the other villages, and the infrastructure projects were aimed at rebuilding those roads, but also people would take side roads to their lunches all the time. And so it wasn't so women didn't necessarily stay at home, and also there were so much like narratives of premarital sexual relations, including like between married Chamorro women that I talked I opened this presentation with. So how they got to certain places, like I'm gonna leave it up to y'all. Like it's just it's not so simple, you know, it's like as what the archive is saying. In any case, this is a point I wanted to reemphasize that the Spanish Empire wanted Guahan to be more profitable. And so it was trying to create these different policies and different forms of rebuilding and expanding Guam's infrastructure to make it a stronger export colony. And it was mainly, they're mainly focused on rebuilding and expanding the harbors in Apra and Umatec. They also wanted to renovate Guahan's roads and colonial buildings like the Casa Real, which is the governor's palace in Umatec, and also the one in Hagåtña. But the one in Umatec was because the governor would go there when the galleons came, so he was trying to make it nicer there as well. And it's both for show, it's like a show of colonial might, and also to say that, hey, we're still investing in this place, we're watching you. It's like saying that there's not necessarily just neglect happening. And tomorrow men were supposed to work in these public works projects, as I said, but many of them didn't show up. And so the Spanish colonial government was kind of saying that it's like dragging people like against their will. They're supposed to be doing this. It's part of their that like they only had to pay property taxes, so they Chamorros didn't have to do as much compared to others colonial subjects, and so they were kind of yeah, really putting down Chamorro men for not showing up to these projects. And so I read these forms of like non-labor for the Spanish colonial government as a point of resistance, but also a way to deprioritize what the Spanish want. I think what Chamorro men were thinking of was providing for their families by and going to Lanchos to help grow and help their families sustain themselves. They were not thinking of rebuilding the road in the same way that the Spanish did. But like so I think I went through this already, so I'm gonna skip this slide. So the way that the Spanish were able to get these projects done was to build the Presidio Marianas, which was a prison. Presidio can mean fort, it can mean colony. For Guam, and the Marianas in general, Presidio means both colony, and a fortified colony because it was a militarized colony. So there was a soldiers' barracks in Hagåtña around the La Plaza Mayor too. So uh but it also means prison. And in this case, they were trying to build a presidio in the Presidio Marianas. So they were building a prison because they wanted to bring Filipino convict laborers to get the rest of this job done. This is a picture of Filipino convict workers working in the Philippines, but you can imagine a similar picture must have happened in Guam. So why did they want to use Filipino convict labor? According to the colonial documents and memoir of Corte that I read, a lot of the narratives that were there was that they thought Filipinos were more hardworking and had better agricultural and craftsmanship skills. The Philippines was a more economically prosperous colony, so they were thinking, oh, it's just naturally Filipinos have better, are able to grow the land more, and they have better craftsmanship skills. They also thought it'd be easy for Filipinos to adapt to Guahan's climate because it's a similar climate. And also, they chose to use convicts because they didn't think that regular Filipinos would willingly want to move to the Marianas. So they had this narrative that the Marianas, especially the Northern Marianas, was a desolate place. It's very distant, far from civilization, and Filipinos would not want to go there because Philippines was a relatively more well-off, beautiful place. And so they chose convicts because convicts didn't really have a choice. It was either stay in prison in the Philippines or go to work in um, individual farm plots or public works projects in Guam. And so in 1861, they began recruiting convict workers, and then they built the Presidio Marianas to house them. So the Filipino convicts were also not necessarily just like violent criminals like murderers and such. They also included like people who were deserted or stole from the Spanish military bases. So but one common thing is that they were mainly farmers or craftsmen because they wanted people to work and they wanted people to build stuff. And so many of the convicts were sent to individual plots, farm plots, or they were sent to repair the main road, or they were sent to Upper Harbor or the Casa Real. And the reward was a sentence reduction and or an end in their sentence, or they got to gain ownership of their plots that they farmed. Um, Mind you, this was all done without Chamorro consent. So the lands were taken by the Spanish government and then given to some of those Filipino convict workers who then married Chamorro women. So then it became another Chamorro family's land. So it's a complicated story, actually. This is a picture of the governor's house built with Filipino convict labor and also a little bit of Chamorro men's labor during their public works projects as well. And I wanted to show that this large structure basically is being built from the 4 decades of Filipino labor being brought to Guam. And so, in reading through these stories and reports, of Filipino comics labor, I determined and basically summarized three different purposes. One was that Filipino convict labor's purpose was to expand Spanish colonial control in Guam at a time where it was weak, where it needed to grow its power. Second, they were trying to punish Filipinos who resisted Spanish colonial policies, and this included people who, you know, didn't want to work for the Spanish army or didn't want to be conscripted, and it also included people who did violent things like sexual violence, who committed murder. And so there's a large category like who was a criminal. It really it was like they did a range of crimes, and so it was like against Chamorro's consent and against to have them brought to Guam, and then that actually determined, I think, how a lot of the relations went about after. And I think it also led to the further condemning of Chamorro women who willingly or not willingly, it's like difficult to determine in the archive sometimes, uh had like sexual relations with these men. Finally, I think that's the most important point that I don't want to skip it, is that they really were focused on transforming Guahan and thus disrupting Chamorro's kinships and ties to place and ties to people's clan lands and also the resistance to Spanish colonial desires. So what about Filipinos who didn't work? There are quite a bit of them actually, and the Principalia regularly reported on them because it was their responsibility as political leaders of the village to report back to the Spanish colonial governor, and also because some of these folks were really doing a lot of horrible things like stealing cattle, and like those cattle were used for things in people's ranchos. And they really disrupted the local order and the public order. Uh, Mainly, they were being reported on for vagrancy, which is basically not being being wandering, not showing up for work, having affairs with more women, but also sexual violence. And so they were doing all sorts of things that were both we could maybe see as resistance, but also we have to not romanticize resistance. That resistance could also exert this masculine form of freedom, which included sexual violence against Chamorro women. Either way, something that I really want to emphasize is that Chamorro women's voices and perspectives are often erased if this is the only archive and this is our only understanding of what happened back then. It reproduces sarcosm as this process of replacement erasure and how that works with gender to really limit and restrict what we know of what Chamorro women did, and also the way in which gender and sexuality are ways to control relations, as Mikhail Foucault would say. It's a really long academic philosophical thing, but I'm going to go basically talk about how when you control how people relate to one another at its core, and how much of that is gendered and sexualized. You're able to maintain control of a society. In a colonized place, you're able to control multiple colonized peoples, and that shows how a global empire is able to work. And so, for the case of Filipinos who didn't work, it was not just about criminalizing Filipinos who did do bad things. It's also about reinforcing the uh the assimilation of Chamorro elites into these codes and like logics of what is right, what is not right, and how they're speaking on behalf of Chamorro women, including those who like Ana Flores, who was probably from what the archive was saying, enjoying that affair. Like, and so we don't know what the perspectives of these Chamorro women are today because that's been erased. And so I want to foreground the importance of centering the oral histories that folks do have of their Chamorro Filipino relations, but also reading against the grain when it comes to colonial archive, because oftentimes even if it's Chamorro written, it still erases Chamorro women's agency and their perspectives. And also the complaints often led to deportation as a resolution to Filipino violence. So I want to conclude here with asking, what would it look like to instead recenter Enough Malik and not like, I think sometimes we see Enough Malik as hippy dippy. Everybody gets along. Oh my God, it's great. Like I think about my
Everybody
mentor.
gets cotton candy in Afamaulik. That's the
Yeah.
cotton
Or
candy and unicorns and
yeah,
chamorro chip cookies.
or Pugla or Tuba, let's be real. So Tuba was actually brought into Guam by Filipinos too. So that's an interesting thing. And cockfighting, that's the other thing we brought. And that was in the archive, and I was like, oh man. And the other thing was the introduction of like mass gambling was like the reason why the Principality was trying to control is because these Filipino colonists are really like getting these were encouraging Chamorros to also join them. So they were like there was one that I was trying to find, and it was like deep in my archive where they're like they're just partying, they're not working. They had a fiesta, and I was like, that's I was like that. I can imagine that happening today, and I thought it was so funny, um, because it's really like for a colonial government, it seems so like irritating, and like pe these people are being so stubborn, and like they're like they're not focusing on what's important, but I think they are. In a way, they're focusing on like having an everyday slow form of life and like remembering not to just work all the time. But that also means like, like what I think I'm trying to say is like we also can't romanticize resistance. And Filipino resistance, especially Filipino convicts resistance, did result in violence. And so I think for me, it's not just like about that there needs to be a resolution to violence, but I think there needs to be more conversation and action about recentering enough of Malik as like, like correcting something that's wrong. Like we're here, and how do we get up here? And balance itself, I think what carceral studies and feminists, and especially Black abolitionists have taught me is that like it's not about, making everything like super hunky dory. It's about really changing what we think of justice, changing what we think of mutuality and mutual relations. And I think for me, it's about how do we then like if Filipinos did do this, um how do we make things more reciprocal or mutual in a way that doesn't replicate colonial ideas of what's good and what's moral? And I think that's a very hard question to answer. And but I wanted to begin to think about, and I'm hoping that my work can contribute to these conversations as well. And I was thinking particularly of chanchule, like how would you chanchule in that circumstance? And sometimes I think it's easier to say it like in and center to more practices in that way because it's hard to define to other folks, and like even in explaining these Chintule and Inafamaluk to other folks in the continent. I have a hard time. So I just cite Dr. Underwood. It's easiest. Sorry, Dr. Underwood, it's easiest. His definition is so good. And well, for me, it's just like, how do you Chintule in that way? Like, how? And I hope, like, we can have more community conversations about this because I think I just like want my work to begin this conversation and then think about how to then like actually enact it because I think these are similar things that are happening today with the large rates of sexual violence in Guam and deportation happening all over island. I think it, especially with the military buildup, I think these things are only going to get worse, especially when there's a lot of poverty and crime. How do we recenter enough American Chula in this? Because what I've been trying to show in this are presentation is that Spanish colonialism and later in in my discussion of U.S. Forms of justice and conflict resolution are often imbued with their own colonial ideas that don't always work and kind of actually contradict more ones. And finally, how would Chamorro's women's stories, um, how would they how would they potentially nuance what we know of Chamorro-Filipino relations, especially in this time where, um, a lot of it is written either in Spanish or I think a lot of the archives that survive are written after the US took over. So some of it's like looking down on the Spanish time or some of it's romanticized. So it's a very difficult thing. So I think that's the question I want to end with. But I do want to say so just maase salamat and thank you all for listening. And please contact me if you have further questions or suggestions. If you have family members who know more about this time or have oral histories about this time, please let me know, especially like I'd love to get in contact. Um, I have like a my you could use my personal email or contact the Fanachu podcast again. Yeah, I think. Yeah, so that you can reach out to me. But yeah, I'd love to hear folks' questions in the Q&A as well. And I'm
Oh,
gonna stop sharing now. Yeah.
oh yes. Thank you so much for that, for sharing this, because the Spanish period of our history is one where, as you know, now that
Hmm.
you've dived into it, you've read the documents, you've struggled with the cursive. Uh,
Yeah.
and I just have dipped my toe into the cursive sometimes. And, it's one of those where it stretches across hundreds of years. There's so much that's happening in it. We do have a significant amount of archives for it, but historians for the longest time ignored it because it's the Spanish,
Hmm.
and it's the time when Chamorro ceased to exist, so there can't be any Chamorro stuff there, right?
Yeah.
And it's just the story of Spanish governors. And that
Hmm.
was the way that canonically that period of history was told as just the Spanish governors. You just kind of chronicle that they come along, and some of them are corrupt and some of them mean well, and then the Americans come and that's it.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so what's wonderful to see though in the work of Carlos Madrid, even somebody like David Atienza and your work here, and even when you were last on the Fanachu podcast and you were also talking about the deportados, the Filipino revolutionaries at the very
Hmm.
end of the
Yeah.
Spanish period, is, this was a time of tremendous change in the Spanish Empire.
Hmm.
And it's fascinating how so many historians, because of just kind of colonial complacency, want to just pretend like Guam was insulated from all of that. That
Yeah.
Guam
Hmm.
was a place where, yeah, nothing ever happened. It was just coconut trees still and coconut crabs, and nothing changed. Everything
Yeah.
that's the same. But when you really get into it, things are happening. Identities are being changed. People are negotiating. People are challenging. There's quite a bit of violence, resistance, and as you have pointed out here, there's Chamorros that are using their voice, but there's still a lot of voicelessness, even in these archives,
Hmm.
where Filipino voices are appearing, some Chamorro voices are appearing, but then some Chamorros appear in presence, but voiceless. Like, so it's very
Hmm.
interesting to see. And there was one question about this, or a comment
Hmm.
about this, because you mentioned sort of the role of Chamorro women at this time appearing as girlfriends or victims of sexual violence, like they are
Hmm.
keeping Filipinos from doing their work, or that they are
Hmm.
sort of victims of Filipino depravity and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And so the comment was that it reminded somebody of how at the beginning of the Spanish colonization, Chamorro women are have to be protected by the Spanish priests, or they see visions, and Chamorro women have no voice of their own. They just exist to
Yeah.
serve the larger narratives that are happening at that time. And so,
Yeah.
so if
Yeah.
you wanted to kind of comment on your reading, because reading, you were talking about reading against the grain of the archive. The archive
Hmm.
presents you with kind of how the hegemonic view is, but if you wanted to share a little bit about sort of what you are getting from reading against it, and also you were talking about oral
Hmm.
histories and how you've been talking to some other Chamorro and Filipina scholars about like how
Hmm.
to try to excavate some of these voices, what might some of these stories be from these women? Did you want to share a little bit
Hmm.
about it? I know it might be preliminary.
Yeah.
Share a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I think that comment is very right that it's like a longer historical process of like the colonial government's desire to do that, right? To erase Chamorro women's perspectives and like and looking at Tina Delisle's work, Dr. Solder's work, Dr. Hattori's work, you can see like a lot of more stories of Chamorro women. I think it's a bit di more difficult with the Spanish era, honestly. And I think a lot of it is reading back at the archives. And I was looking, I talked to Tina about this too. I looked through her citation of Agatha Johnson's framings of stories about the Sadok Hagatya, and I went backwards. I like went through her memoirs, and I'm still in the process of looking through it. But if you really look at it, there were and people, different Chamorro women's reflections on the Spanish era. I've been reading it to see like what part of it is just like you can tell from the tone, but like the core of it is that people were saying there were places for Chamorro women to gather. There were places that Chamorro women went to that uh like weren't necessarily like if you look at the colonial law, they weren't supposed to be there, but they still show up. So in that ways we're reading against the grain. But I do think that what's difficult is when we're confronted with these issues, with these like instances and cycles of sexual violence, how do we then balance the like talking about things that have not been talked about today, while also not eradicating Chamorro women's agency and the story, and not invalidating the stories of Chamorro women that married into Filipino families and are the ancestors of many uh, Chamorro families today. So I think that's like something that's difficult. And what I've been doing is, I think, honestly, continuously consulting my Chamorro women and feminist mentors, scholars, and social workers, folks who have more experience working on instances of sexual violences and like healing from traumas. Because with militarization, as we know, like it looking at the work of like Cynthia Enloe and other folks, it's like when militarization comes gendered and sexual violence. And in Guam, it happens a lot. And I think it's what's hard is that it may not always be talked about, and the way that it's yeah, addressed may not always be in a way that really produces healing. Maybe it does, but I think centering Chamorro forms of healing are really important. And so I think what I'm envisioning with my work too is to eventually have these conversations about Chamorro, centering Chamorro and Filipino forms of healing, and developing projects that we're and workshops and regular sessions for us to actually like have ways to address violence in a way that center our own indigenous and also for Filipinos, many of us are mixed race, like I'm mixed. So maybe you don't want to claim something that's indigenous that's further out, but like something that is in your culture, even like the Filipino and Chamorro understandings of healing and reciprocity. Like, I think that that's what's more difficult. I think that's what we have to do to really center a feminist form of care and understanding. But yeah, it is difficult, I would say, and it requires like really being like were they supposed to be here? No, they weren't, but they showed up. What does that mean? Like, and other things like, I think with the sexual violence, I've really been working on it with folks, and I think it requires really, um, I think we have to have more of a larger conversation and a societal change around how sexual violence is talked about and addressed. I think that is another thing
Oh,
that
definitely, Hungan.
important.
And just one, because we're almost out of time, and so one
Hmm.
quick question from somebody who remembers that you were on Fanachu three
Oh.
3 years ago, and that you were talking about Mabini and the Mabini statues on Guam.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
somebody, and so they are just asking kind of, do you have, did you publish about the Mabini statues? Did you do any more research on that, or
Mm.
what came from your research and your discussion about Mabini and his time on Guam?
Oh, yes. So I published an article that you can find in the Frontiers Journal. It's called Sculpted Memories. If you search on Google my name, and you can find it. But uh, I also from that, when I was doing my PhD dissertation, I found a reference to Melchora Aquino, the elderly Filipino woman who was sent to Guam during the Spanish era. And I then started uncovering stories of Filipino women being sent to Guam. And so at the same time as these Filipino men I discussed, and that's like also a part of my book, but I'm trying to decide at the moment which one I'm gonna focus on more, Chamorro women's stories or in that time period and like their the complicated like sexual relations they had with Filipino men or like Filipino women who were incarcerated in Guam. It requires a different focus. I'm trying to like see which ones I can fit, which ones I want to focus on. But I will say that even in that instance, the previous Filipino community commemorations, even from like the 1960s and 70s, did discuss more of Mabini and Aquino, but not in the same ways. It was mainly Mabini and Artemio Ricarte who were lauded. So that's kind of why I moved away from that work too, because I wanted to think about how my own like Filipino women mentors like Ate Vivian Dames and Dr. Nerissa Underwood have built in a lot of the Saturday work before Filipinos Forgotten, and how we can also learn, well, and we are learning from their example and mentorship because my God, they have helped me so much emotionally too. So I wanted to think about why women Filipino women's mentorship and like our genealogies of that too. Yeah. Oh,
Biba,
Miguel,
Biba.
sorry. Yep.
No, no,
You're
Smith.
muted. Yes, sorry.
I was just downloading the article.
Oh, yes, sorry. I think I sent it to you a long time ago, but
You might have, but
yeah.
I was just checking the link for so that I could before I shared it with people. But but yes, and I was gonna but Sidzus Masi, there was a few more questions, but we are just about out of time. I did want to let you know because we did have a donation that came in recently to the Guam Museum from
Hmm.
somebody whose great uncle was stationed here at the very beginning of the US's time in Guam, who
Hmm.
his great uncle was like a medical doctor or a military doctor here, who has who basically has some pictures with some of those deportados and stuff like that
Mm. Oh,
and so
wow.
on. And
Hmm.
so we're going to scan them at some point, and then I'll share that with you. But I think he also then also wrote some notes too
Ooh.
about his time because I think he may have also interacted with Mabini too. But
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. Thanks, Miget, for sharing that with me. And I do want to mention that in that article, after the presentation, I realized that I found some archives that where Mabini actually interacted with like Chamorros, in particular, a certain Chamorro priest.
ah,
Yeah,
okay.
quite in a different way than the original narrative. So it kind of led to my more nuanced understanding that he did actually have some interactions with Chamorros. It was just that because he was disabled and in prison, it was only on certain days. So, and he was really sickly.
Oh,
So, but
interesting.
oh wait, no, this is where the partying was. That's why I couldn't find it. But the other Filipino convicts went out and they partied with Chamorros all the time. And they said that it was like wild in the Presidio and accent because people were partying too much. And it was honestly because these Filipino revolutionaries that were incarcerated in Guam were like had more money. Like yeah, so they had these wild parties basically.
It's
But I thought it was funny.
See, that makes more historical sense than when you read some of the other histories and it's like it just doesn't jive. It just doesn't connect with. But when now that you fill in that historical detail and it's like that makes sense. They were in Guam, and
Yeah.
of course. But
I was
okay.
like, really? Guam people are not that stiff. I was
Yeah. It's like but But okay, that see, so I'm looking forward, Josephine, to you
like,
coming back on in the next few weeks or few
Mhm.
months, hopefully for a Filipinos for Guahan sort of episode,
Yes, yeah.
because I'm
Hmm.
looking forward to reinvigorating that conversation. There's more talk now about these issues once again, and so I'm looking forward to that. But I do want to thank you for sharing and updating your research. You know, this is just a part of our history in which we've so much work has been done to get Chamorros excited about our ancient ancestors, get us
Hmm.
excited about our World War II relatives, our grandparents, our great grandparents, our parents. But for this period that you're researching into now, it's one where it's harder because our relationship to them is more complicated because some people say, well, they're not Matapang and they're not Harao and they're not the great chiefs of the
Yeah.
past. They're not the suffering people in Menengan from more recently. Who were they?
Hmm.
But the more that we know about them, we find that there are these fascinating, complicated figures from that time, and that they were through these interactions. What I love is through these interactions with peoples in the Philippines, peoples
Hmm.
elsewhere in the Spanish Empire who also had questions of their own national identity, anti-colonial
Hmm.
spirit, were also resisting in big, small ways, colonial forces that Chamorros too were also feeling that. And so that's what I love in these
Hmm.
conversations is that we learn more about our great great grandparents at that time too. And so I
Hmm.
appreciate the work that you are doing and that others are doing to help introduce us to them. So Jesus
Yeah,
Mas,
thank
thank
you,
you for
Miguel.
joining.
Oh, and then before we end, I forgot to say like that actually is one of the main points I think that Dr. Madrid made in the last podcast too, is like that Chamorros had a lot more political power. Like even like the cabezas from Barangay was like a Spanish system, but Chamorros used it to elect their clan leaders.
Hmm.
So but the clan leaders that were like the ones that had like, relative like economic political privilege were the ones who got to be part of the Principalia. But that's still like it's still part of the Chamorro society and like it's following some of the practices. So it's not like they weren't actually just assimilated. It's not the full story.
I
Yeah.
Si Diyos masi Josephine and si Diyos masi para hamzu todos ni umeega para umeekungok. Adios.
Yeah.
Este
Thank you for
kita
taking the time. Duh.